係而家試音，我少係。
黃伯你好啊，咁你應該係第一次嚟英國倫敦參加六四集會啦。咁你個心情或者你個感覺係點樣咧？嚟到倫敦參加六四集會？
其實我唔係第一次嚟啦。喺2019年反送中運動之前，六四我係喺倫敦呢個位置，我嚟抗議屠夫政權屠殺人民，我係嚟過啦。2019年6月4號，
原來你都係嚟倫敦。
我仲企喺嗰個台，同呢度倫敦嘅僑領Dr. 吳呂南博士喺度一齊發表一啲意見。
咁今次係你第二次嚟？
第二次嚟㗎啦。
但係個心情個感覺應該好唔同啊。
當然唔同啦。當年我哋存有希望，希望改變到中國政府。就算香港，我哋都存有好大嘅希望。喺2019年6月9號之前，就算戴耀廷嗰個35+1，我哋都係存有希望進行一個希望工程。點知呢個極權屠夫政權係將我哋僅有嘅希望，我哋合法嘅權益都剝削埋。
咁你今日嗰個訴求同19年嗰個訴求有冇唔同到呢？
都係冇乜分別。我係譴責89年6月4號呢個屠夫政權濫殺無辜，殺啲手無寸鐵嘅學生市民，呢個係人神共憤嘅。
咁你依家睇到香港維園俾人圍封咗啦，俾啲黑警，咁你個感覺係點咧？覺得
個心係好實好實。其實喺2019年之後，個強權政治係威脅緊每一個市民。入邊牆內嘅兄弟難過，香港嘅市民仍然都好似喺一個大監獄裏邊。
追究屠城責任，無望六四，無望六四，光復香港，光復香港。
你覺得依家仍然留喺香港嘅人，你覺得佢哋可以做啲咩呢？
年青人多啲增值，機會係俾有準備好嘅人。
大家好，我係
即係可能讀多啲書啊。
邱文俊。
讀多啲書，讀唔到書嘅增加多啲技能。
大家好，
乜嘢工種、乜嘢技能都學啲。
好，唔該晒你，唔該晒你，唔該晒你。
喺天安門，中共用軍隊真槍實彈係去屠殺學生、屠殺人民。今年呢33年。倫敦悼念六四委員會合辦機構如下：天安門母親之友、國際大赦回鄉英國、支援中國民運行動、民主香港、Labour for Hong Kong 同埋英國港僑協會。
It's 4th of June today, and 33 years ago, the CCP sent in People's Liberation Army and brutally oppressed students, dissidents who called for democratization of China at Tiananmen Square. Deng Xiaoping, the leaders of CCP, together with other elders, imposed a state curfew and ordered the army to intervene the protest by force between the night of June 3rd and 4th of June, and the protest turned into a bloodshed. According to the Red Cross, over 2,700 people died at the scene. But due to the state censorship, it was impossible to certain the number of deaths in that day. And today, the organizers the organizers is London Remember John 4th Committee, and the co-organizers will be Friends of Panama Mothers, Amnesty International, Chinese Solidarity Campaign, D4HK, Liberty for Hong Kong, and the final one is Hong Kongers in Britain.
33年嚟，6.4嘅亡魂，我哋倫敦，無論係之前喺香港，每一年6.4燭光都不滅。國安惡法立法之後，喺香港喺維園舉起一點燭光去悼念亡魂，都竟被污蔑成為一種罪行。喺啱啱嘅香港，攞紮鮮花出維園、出銅鑼灣，喺荒謬嘅香港，喺圍城入邊，都竟然黑警都會話嗰紮花係能夠煽動人民。一個什麼樣嘅政權，一個邪惡嘅政權，一個不堪嘅政權，由89年開始。邪惡嘅政權用好多高壓嘅手段，係去消滅、係去迫害民主嘅聲音、意見嘅人士。89年以嚟，受到壓迫、受到迫害嘅人，包括19年香港人反送中運動，一樣同樣受到呢個邪惡政權嘅迫害同埋打壓。喺香港，我哋會見到我哋嘅好多嘅手足喺監獄，就算喺成個香港嘅圍牆，好多嘢喺國安惡法嘅白色恐怖底下，但係我見到好多人心係不死嘅，包括而家喺呢度喺倫敦，喺成個英國，喺成個世界各地。都係遍地開花，因為悼念6.4呢個係全世界追求民主公義、追求民主自由、追求普世價值應有之義，悼念亡魂。所以今日喺呢度一陣，謝家朗講完英文嘅介紹之後咧，我哋會有1分鐘嘅默哀。
Thank you all Hong Kongers and everyone. Stand solidarity with the people who fight for democracy in China. Next, we will have 1 minute silence to let us memorize those people who died in the Tiananmen Square. We may start the 1 minute silence.
而家係默哀開始，1分鐘。為6.4死難亡魂默哀。默哀完畢，結束一黨專政，
結束一黨專政，
無望6.4，
無望6.4，
薪火相傳。 香港，
時代革命，
香港獨立。
Fight for freedom!
With Hong Kong,
Fight for freedom!
stand with Hong Kong.
End dictatorship!
接住嚟咧係6.4死難者名單係由我哋邀請大會安排嘅嚇朗讀6.4死難者名單。
Now we invite Anon to read out partial list of victims, please.
蒋洁莲、
皖南、
杨明湖、
萧杰、
陈来顺、
郝志金、
谢金锁、
萧博、
孙辉、
陆春林、
张向红、
陈仁兴、
王一飞、
杨彦生、
张景、
段昌龙、
王卫平、
王建平、
王培文、
董霄军、
袁立、
叶伟航、
吴国峰、
王超、
安基、
余地、
严文、
钱进、
刘宏、
周庆、
周德宝、
吕鹏、
庄杰生、
袁敏玉、
杜燕英、
陆建国、
王争胜、
李长生、
奚桂如、
戴伟、
吴向东、
刘建国、
赖比、
董玲、
国安民、
林仁富、
孙彦昌、
钱辉、
周兵、
卜长奎、
卞宗旭、
田道明、
何洁、
宗晓明、
刘彦生、
温杰、
李慧泉、
张汝宁、
刘凤根、
李猛、
奔云海、
刘洪涛、
周新明、
王刚、
张玲、
韩子全、
李德志、
周永琪、
南化通、
贺安斌、
宋桂兴、
穆桂兰、
熊志明、
张伟华、
龚继芳、
刘春勇、
刘俊和、
梁宝兴、
阮以伟、
苏金坚、
张裸红、
王志英、
王宏琪、
李淑珍、
马成芬、
杨振江、
李丽、
寇霞、
谭修、
刘景华、
王铁军、
黄涛、
陶志感、
许建平、
何国、
李辉、
罗维、
齐文、
刘占敏、
石岩、
任建明、
孙铁、
苏生基、
任文莲、
黄培福、
郑春富、
曹正平、
李正英、
杨汝平、
王庆珍、
周德平、
王文明、
尹静、
杨子平、
赵龙、
雷广泰、
钟俊君、
高原、
李世莲、
邝敏、
尹顺兴、
何世泰、
周玉珍、
耀爱国、
宋宝生、
陈生林、
石海文、
杨汉雷、
王耀和、
彭军、
刘翔、
苏兴、
包修东、
赵德江、
崔林峰、
王芳、
刘兴生、
张桂梅、
李春、
杜光学、
孙晓峰、
赵天仇、
胡星云、
狄顺、
陈子琪、
吉利、 成、陈松杰、王东喜、古春明、韩俊勇、李铁刚、王英、王俊基、夏之磊、林涛、张健、李平、马建武、黄新华、曹茂先、宗国武、白金川、江嘉兴、金颖、梁建波、王永贞、刘永阳、刘忠、布尔克、桂丽帆、马凤龙、马俊飞、徐瑞和、陈永平。
光復香港，
時代革命，
平反六四，無忘六四。
無忘六四。
接落嚟就係宣讀天安門母親六四慘案33週年祭。
Coming next, we will read out the statement given by the Tiananmen mothers. Please.
For truth and justice, we will persevere. On the 33rd anniversary of the June 4th massacre, 33 years ago, a brutal tragedy of unparalleled savagery occurred in China, sending shockwaves across the nation and around the world. The ruling Communist Party of China and the Chinese government, in complete disregard of the lives of the hundreds of thousands of students and common people along the 10-mile Chang'an Avenue, used the military to indiscriminately murder innocent people in the capital city of Beijing with live ammunition. The armed forces aimed their guns at them and even drove tanks to crush the crowd, killing and injuring thousands. This government-led massacre caught Beijing residents completely off guard. At around 10 p.m. on June the 3rd, under cover of darkness, martial law troops rode tanks and armored vehicles from all directions toward Tiananmen Square. On their way, they sprayed students and residents with gunfire and chased after those trying to escape, leaving heavy casualties in their wake. Early the next morning, on June 4th, when student protesters evacuated from the square in files and walked to Liubukou in Xitan, the army unleashed poisonous tear gas with paralyzing nerve agents, causing the students and residents at the scene to collapse on the ground, unable to move due to difficulty in breathing and a feeling of suffocation. A row of tanks ran over the fallen crowd, killing or seriously injuring more than 10 students on the spot. Among the 203 victims we have found so far are 61 undergraduates and graduate students from various universities, 14 elementary and middle school students, and 14 missing persons. The youngest was only 9 and the oldest 66. In April and May 1989, millions of students and common people joined marches, petitions, and protests, exercising the right conferred to Chinese citizens under the Constitution and the law. These were lawful acts that did not violate the Constitution whatsoever. From beginning to end, the movement upheld the principles of peace, rationality, and non-violence. Up until the end, the movement upheld the principles of peace, rationality, and non-violence. Up until the military crackdown, the entire social order had been stable. This stability was conscientiously maintained by the students and other members of the public in the nation's capital. The students and the public in the demonstrations were simply demanding an end to corruption and official malfeasance, freedom of speech, disclosure of officials' assets, and the establishment of a mechanism for civil society to monitor the integrity of government officials. None of these demands deviated from the constitutional framework. When the two sides disagreed, the protesters did did nothing more than ask the government for a reasonable resolution within the scope of the Constitution and the law, through the legal process, consultation and dialogue. But the ruling CPC and the Chinese government completely ignored the people's reasonable demands and chose a course of action completely contrary to modern civilization. They abused their power to savagely and brutally kill and crush their own citizens with bullets and tanks, and subsequently launched a fascist-like nationwide probe, hurling the whole society into a state of terror and putting everyone in danger. We cannot help but ask, did the student movement, which merely offered suggestions to help the ruling party and the government to serve the people with greater integrity, really warrant military suppression and arbitrary killing of innocent citizens? As the student protest spread from Beijing to the whole country, they became a way for the people to express their good wishes for the government. And what is your definition of the people? Do the people become the enemy once they put forth a recommendation? The Chinese ruling party and government then went on to absolve themselves from their murderous crime and responsibility under the guise of quelling counter-revolutionary riots. Isn't it too cruel? Sending the army to slaughter students and civilians in peacetime is undeniably an atrocity against humanity. In the face of the vibrant lives shot to death in the June 4th massacre, the unilateral, fact-denying characterization and rhetoric of China's ruling party and government are pale and devoid of humanity. They will not withstand the test of history. Over the past 33 years, 64 members of our group of bereaved family members of June 4th victims have passed away. This year, we've had 2 more deaths, Yin Min and Liu Qian. Liu, the oldest member of our group, died in late April this year at the age of 97. Seeking government accountability for the massacre in accordance with the law is our legitimate right. For 33 years, we have been pursuing the 3 demands of truth, compensation, and accountability in a peaceful and rational manner, calling for a dialogue with the government through the legal process to resolve the issues related to the June 4th massacre. We appeal to your conscience on behalf of the families of those killed. For fairness and justice, we will persevere.
追究屠城責任，
追究屠城責任，
結束一黨專政，
結束一黨專政，
香港獨立，
唯一出路，
香港獨立。
唯一出路。
我哋今日咧大會係邀請到嘅一陣嘅講者咧，包括咧有英國上下議院嘅議員啦，天安門運動學生領袖、民運支持者、工會人士、西藏維吾爾族、烏克蘭人民代表等等。接住嚟第一位講者咧就係國際特赦組織嘅代表 Susan Cook。
Speakers for tonight invited including lords, MPs, Tiananmen student leaders, activists, Tibetans, Uyghur, Ukrainian representatives and others. And today, first, please welcome our first speaker, Susan Koo, to speak with us, which is the representative of Amnesty International.
Everybody, and thank you for being here with us tonight. As we know, we are here to commemorate the Tiananmen crackdown. Individually representing our own organisations, I'm here to speak for Amnesty International. I speak for our organisation only, as do others here. And I want to speak about freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and what is happening now in Hong Kong. Every year on the 4th of June since 1990, the year after the crackdown, up to hundreds of thousands of people joined a candlelit vigil vigil in Hong Kong's Victoria Park to remember those killed during the Tiananmen crackdown. They called on the Chinese authorities to reveal the truth about what happened and take accountability for the fatalities. The vigil has been banned for the last 2 years, ostensibly on COVID-19 grounds. The organiser of the vigil, the Hong Kong Alliance, was forced to disband in September 2021 after coming under increasing pressure since the enactment of Hong Kong's national security law in June 2020. Several of its senior figures are currently in jail. The bravery of those who came out to commemorate the Tiananmen crackdown, despite the threat of arrest, harassment and other repercussions to them and their wider families, shows that the truth can never be completely silenced by repressive governments. Hong Kongers continue to stand up for their rights and for the rights of those in mainland China. Commemoration is not a crime. It is an act we here carry out without fear or threat. In our own parks across the country, you will see commemorations, both personal and public, floral tributes, homemade plaques and shrines, park benches in dedication to loved ones. When my own mum died, a tribute was planted to her in the park across the road from my parents' house, also called Victoria Park. And what a sense of comfort that gives me and those close to her who can sit in the park, remember and feel connected to her. I think now how fortunate I am, we are, as it is an experience, an act, it's a right that has been totally denied to those who lost their loved ones 33 years ago. Commemoration is not a crime. At a personal level, it is an essential part of the grieving process. We are here today to commemorate on behalf of those who cannot, and call for all those arrested and held merely for exercising their human rights to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly to be immediately and unconditionally released. Thank you for being here this evening, standing with us, and more importantly, with them.
無忘六四，無忘六四，薪火相傳，光復香港，時代革命，光復香港，時代革命 ，Free Tibet。接住落嚟係天安門學生領袖邵剛博士。
Coming next, our speaker is Xiao Zhang, a witness and survivor of Tiananmen massacre, who was jailed for his involvement in organizing the pro-democracy movement.
Thank you everyone. "33 years ago, at this hour, Beijing time in the early morning of June 5th, I was back in Peking University after withdrawal from the Tiananmen Square 17 hours earlier. I was among the last protesters to leave Tiananmen Square. I had witnessed the killing of peaceful protesters by the PLA troops and tanks on Western Chang'an Avenue. Back in my dormitory in Beidang, I put on a new t-shirt because my old one was covered in blood. Not my own blood, it was from my fellow protesters who didn't survive the massacre. When I think of them today, I feel sad and guilty. Democracy that we fought for many Hong Kong people are still facing trial for participating in peaceful assembly. Over 1 million Uyghurs and other Turkish Muslims have been detained in concentration camps. Tibetans still have no say in political, social, economic, and cultural issues in their own land. Even in democratic countries, civil rights are facing challenges. In 2015, when Xi Jinping visited the UK, I was arrested when protesting peacefully, and my home was searched by police. Through a long process of suing the police, I found out the CCP delegates even demanded that the UK suspend its own Human Rights Act during the Xi Jinping's visit. The British police claimed that they didn't do what they are asked to do, but my own experience showed that they did compromise human rights in exchange for billions of the trade deal. The recent adoption of the Police of the Crime Bill, which criminalized peaceful protests, is a worrying development that echoes what the CCP regime is doing in China. Today, if there's still any hope, it is the persistence of the Tiananmen Mother. It is the courage of those ordinary people standing in front of the tank. 33 years ago, facing the choice between life and death, between democracy and autocracy, between human dignity and life without freedom. They made their decision, and I will always remember that choice they made. Thank you.
Kết thúc一黨專政，
結束一黨專政，
無望六四，
無望六四，
薪火相傳。接住落嚟係香港監察行政總裁羅傑斯。
For next, may we please welcome Ben Roger, the Chief Executive of Hong Kong Watch, to give us a speech.
Thank you so much. I want to begin with some words in Cantonese, but I hope that the spirit of these words will speak for all the peoples across China who are suffering under the Chinese Communist Party regime, for the Uyghurs, for Tibetans, and for everybody persecuted by this regime. I want to begin by saying, Guang Fok Hong Kong! Guang Fok Hong Kong! Guang Fok Hong Kong! It's a privilege to join you all today, although I do so, like all of us, with a very heavy heart, that 33 years ago, the Chinese Communist Party regime showed its true nature, its true character to the world, not for the first time and not for the last time, but in a very vivid and clear way. A regime that turns its guns on its own people and sends its tanks in against its own people and kills at least 10,000 people, as it did on the 4th of June 1989 in the Tiananmen Square massacre, is never a regime that deserves our respect or legitimacy. Instead, it is a regime that is criminal and that we should stand up and call out. The Tiananmen Square massacre, which of course took place not only in the square itself but in streets around Beijing and cities across China, shows that this is a regime that has no respect at all for human liberty, human life, or human dignity. And that is the case today, just as it was then. So as we come together to commemorate, to mourn, to remember those who gave their lives that day, those who were injured, those who lost loved ones, and those who spent many years in prison and under torture. Let us resolve to continue the fight for which they gave their lives. I believe it's so important that we remember this anniversary every year, but it's especially important that we do so this year for 3 reasons. The first is that the Chinese Communist Party wants to erase memories. It wants to hide history. It wants to cover up the truth. It wants no one to know what happened on the 4th of June 1989. And that is demonstrated not only by the censorship across China, the fact that across China, people born after 1989 may genuinely not know what happened because they do not hear about it in China, or if they do know, they're not allowed to speak about it. Until fairly recently, Hong Kong was the one place under Beijing's rule where it was still possible to commemorate the 4th of June. We saw for many years the candlelit vigils in Victoria Park. I myself attended many of them. But today, Victoria Park in Hong Kong, this very day, is closed. And the police have said that it is a criminal offence to go to the park and a criminal offence to remember this anniversary. And that is therefore all the more reason why we need to be doing what we're doing here today in front of the CCP's embassy. I don't call it the Chinese embassy because it's not the embassy for the people of China. It's the embassy for the dictatorship that has ruled China brutally for more than 70 years. And it's right that we should gather here, as we did earlier today, outside Downing Street, and just now I came from Piccadilly Circus. So across London there have been 3 rallies to commemorate this anniversary, and I think that is so important. We must not allow the regime to erase history, and indeed history itself keeps a record, and so the crimes of the 4th of June will never be forgotten despite the regime's best efforts. The second reason why it's so important that we gather today is that today, 33 years on from the Tiananmen massacre, slow-motion Tiananmen Square massacres are taking place throughout the places that are ruled by the CCP. They may not involve tanks and guns, but they involve detention centres and instruments of torture and repressive laws and disappearances. We think of the Uyghur genocide. We think of the atrocities in Tibet. We think of the worst persecution that Christians have faced in China since the Cultural Revolution. The barbaric practice of forced organ harvesting, which an independent tribunal a few years ago described as crimes against humanity and said that this regime is a criminal state. We think of the crackdown throughout China on any form of dissent, civil society, lawyers, independent bloggers, journalists, whistleblowers. Of course, we think of the dismantling, complete dismantling of Hong Kong's freedoms in total violation of an international treaty, the Sino-British Joint Declaration. And we watch with deep concern the growing threats to Taiwan, and we should stand with Taiwan in these times of increased threat. And thirdly, there is a third reason why today is so important. And that is that this regime is not only repressive against people within its own borders, it is increasingly threatening freedom itself and our own freedoms well beyond its borders. I myself have had a very small taste of it, and nothing I've experienced compares remotely with what many of you have experienced and people in Hong Kong and across China and in East Turkestan and Tibet face. But nevertheless, I've had some experience, and I can see the lengths to which this regime, represented in the building behind us, seeks to go in order to silence critics and opposition and dissent around the world. And we must not allow that to happen. We must never be afraid to gather here today, because gathering here today outside the embassy, and as we did in Piccadilly Circus and outside Downing Street, we are gathering here for the people who can no longer gather in Tiananmen Square or in Victoria Park or across the places that the CCP controls. And I should say, just before I conclude, to Hong Kongers especially, but for all of us, I brought my yellow umbrella here today. I brought it for two reasons. There had been rumours that there might be rain. Thankfully that hasn't happened. But more importantly, I brought it as a symbol of solidarity, not only with the people of Hong Kong, but with everybody suffering under the CCP's repression. As I conclude, let me say this. This weekend, we are remembering two very different, starkly opposite anniversaries. The past few days we've been celebrating the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. And I think we can all agree, whatever our political views or our views on the monarchy, I think we can all agree that the past few days in that celebration have genuinely been a celebration of values of public service, of devotion to a country and a people, of love and compassion. And we've seen that in the atmosphere among the crowds and gatherings over the last few days. But this anniversary that we are commemorating right now is the exact opposite. It's an anniversary where we mourn bloodshed and terror, but also we celebrate the courage and the inspiring devotion of the brave people who gave their lives that day. But we contrast the styles of leadership. The Queen has celebrated 70 years. The CCP has been in power for more than 70 years. But the CCP, in direct opposite of what we've just been celebrating the last few days, the CCP represents a hatred of freedom, a threat to life, an assault on human dignity, and a repression that all of us should continue to fight. So let us, every year and every day between each year, remember the Tiananmen Square massacre, remember June the 4th. Let us come here every year on June the 4th for as long as this regime is in power, and let us never ever give up. We owe it to the people who gave their lives in 1989. We must continue the fight for which they gave their lives. So let us fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong, stand with the Uyghurs, stand with Tibet, and stand with everybody in China who opposes this brutal criminal regime. And I end, as I started, with these words: Guang Fu Hong Kong! Guang Fu Hong Kong! Guang Fu Hong Kong!
Stand with Hong Kong! Stand with Hong Kong!
Fight for freedom!
Stand with Hong Kong! Fight for freedom! Stand with Hong Kong! Stand with Hong Kong!
光復香港！
時代革命！
光復香港！
時代革命！
香港獨立！
唯一出路！
香港獨立！
唯一出路！
Free Tibet！ 接住嚟係天安門母親張先玲嘅錄音。
For next, we will have the Tiananmen Mother's speech, Zhang Xianling, as audio speech and reading out the English version.
我叫张先玲，是天安门母亲亲子成员。今年8月在1989年的6月4日，北京发生了一起震惊世界的惨案。当时的政府出动铁战军，动用坦克、 对反正贪污、反腐败和官僚，而和平示威、手无寸铁的学生和市民，造成大量的学生市民的死亡和伤害。我的孩子王楠发自南路的在长安街上的南川街南口遇难，那时他19岁，是名高中生。那天早上的6点多，见。
阿 Pat 喺度喎，我陣間同佢打招呼。你跟住我去啊？唔係，我要今日採訪㗎嘛。係啊，咪去到10點。咁咪食飯啦。唔係，我睇下啲車。我哋都走㗎啦。你走？係啊，我家姐係咯。而和平示威、手无寸铁的学生和市民，造成大量的学生市民的死亡和伤残。我的孩子王楠，89年6月4日凌晨1点左右，在长安街上的南川街南口遇难，那是他的19岁。那天早上的6点多钟，戒严部队和警察将王楠和另外2个遇难者一起埋在中华门东侧20米远的北街28路内。死者的衣服被雨水冲刷弄好。学校很快要开学，戒严部队只得